Good morning. Welcome to our Bible study this morning. This is video number 7, which is the second video that goes along with our workbook lesson number 6. Okay, so the previous video, video number 6, and this video, which would be video number 7, goes with lesson number 6 in our workbook. In our lesson this morning, we're going to be looking at the Lord raising up Lazarus. And here, once again, we're answering the question, why does evil exist? Why do the harmful things that come upon mankind, why do they exist? While you're turning to John 11, let me just very quickly run through just a few points with you before we get started in this. Keep in mind we said, we know the Lord is in control of everything. Nothing takes place in this world unless He allows it to take place or He causes it, one or the other. We've seen that when it comes to the acts of sin itself, the Bible makes it plain. Sin cannot come from the Lord. He cannot be the originator of sin. He can't. And the Bible makes it plain when it comes to the existence of sin. Satan is the one that brought sin into existence. The Bible is equally plain when it comes to the existence of sin among mankind. Adam is the one that's given the responsibility for that. Then we've seen also that the Lord is the one that many times is responsible for evil, in the sense He is responsible for the results of sin in the world. Okay, things that are the direct result of sin, such as the 10 plagues, and things that are the indirect result of sin, such as the young man's blindness that we looked at in the last lesson, where the Lord clearly said it's not because the young man was blind, nor was it because his parents were blind. The reason why he was born blind was because it would be glorifying to God. Now, let me just tell you real quickly concerning that. The idea is this. Even though the young man's blindness was not the direct result of sin, it wasn't linked to sin in him or his parents' lives, it's still the result of sin in the sense this young man would not have been born blind if we did not live in a sinful, fallen world. It's because this world is fallen that you have his blindness taking place. The Lord had allowed his blindness to take place to better reveal Himself to those who were watching the miracle of His healing. And we saw that's exactly what took place, where the people who watched Christ heal this blind man, and then those who saw the blind man afterward, that he was no longer blind, but he could now see. The Lord used this miracle to show Himself to these people, where they understood more about the Lord because of the results of this young man's healing. In today's lesson, we're looking at John 11. Because in John 11, we're going to be looking at Lazarus and his resurrection. Once again, this has direct bearing on the question, why does the Lord allow evil to exist? Now, again, let me just say one more time. The Lord Himself cannot be held responsible for the existence of sin. Satan is the one that is responsible for bringing sin into existence. Adam is the one responsible for bringing sin into existence among man. The Lord is responsible for bringing into existence the results of sin. The blindness we saw that afflicted this young man last week was the result of sin. The Lord was responsible for that. So too in this case, the death of Lazarus. Now again, did Lazarus die because of any one sin? As far as we know, not. As far as we know, this is again an indirect result of sin. Because Adam died, because Adam sinned, we now have death passed upon all mankind. And so Lazarus, because he is a mortal, he became ill, and that illness led to his death. Both the illness and the death are evils that are in the world because sin exists. In Lazarus' case, his sickness resulted in his physical death. So again, we're looking at the same basic principle. Why does the Lord allow all this to take place? Why did he allow Adam to sin? And it was through that sin then you have all this evil taking place. Why did all this take place? Why did the Lord allow it? John 11, verses 1 through 46. We're going to see what the Bible says using the example of the resurrection of Lazarus. Now a certain man was sick named Lazarus of Bethany, the town of Mary and his sister Martha. It was that Mary which anointed the Lord with ointment, and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. Therefore his sisters sent unto him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom thou lovest is sick. Okay, now get this. Lazarus is sick. He lives in a town that's away from where the Lord is at. The Lord's not at Bethany right now. Mary and Martha are Lazarus' sisters. Because Lazarus is sick, they send a messenger to Christ. They want Christ to know that Lazarus is sick so he can come and heal Lazarus. When he's told that Lazarus is sick, here's the Lord's response. He said, This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God might be glorified thereby. So the Lord said, look, this sickness that Lazarus has is not going to lead to his eventual death, his eventual permanent death, let's put it that way. This sickness isn't meant to kill Lazarus. It's where he'll just remain dead and in the grave. This sickness was meant to glorify God. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. When he heard therefore that he was sick, he abode 2 days still in the same place where he was. Now get this. Jesus knew Lazarus was sick, and yet he stays 2 days where he was before he starts to make the trip to Bethany. We're going to find, as you read down through this story, that what happens during the course of those 2 days? Lazarus dies. Now folks, please, you've got to understand this. Okay? The Lord delays passage to Bethany for 2 days, full well understanding that Lazarus is going to die. He on purpose, did not make the trip earlier so he could heal Lazarus before his death. Now please understand this. Please. The Lord is willingly choosing to allow Lazarus to die. Now you have to understand, he's already affirmed, though, that Lazarus would not remain dead. He knew already he was going to resurrect Lazarus. Remember, he had said prior to this, the sickness is not unto death. Now he did not mean by that, Lazarus is not going to die because of this sickness. What he meant was, and you can see as we read down through the story what's actually taking place, what he meant was, okay, this sickness will bring an end to Lazarus' physical life, but I'll resurrect him again. So he's not going to end up being permanently dead through all this. He's still going to be just fine in the end. But please understand, he chose on purpose to delay 2 days so that Lazarus would physically die. Why? The Lord knew he would be far greater glorified resurrecting Lazarus from the dead than healing Lazarus of his sickness. And this was all going to be about the glory of God. That's what this was all about. Was Lazarus' sickness something that was harmful? Absolutely. Not only did it harm Lazarus because he was sick, but it got Mary and Martha worried about him. That's a type of harm. You know, all of that type of thing. His friends, I'm sure, were concerned about him. Okay, what about when Lazarus died? Was that harmful to Lazarus? Well, in the sense, physical death, in a sense, is harmful for all of us to go through that transition. I mean, sure, Lazarus was a saved man, so it's not like he went to the lake of fire there or nothing like that. But still, you know, physical death is harmful in the sense it's something that we don't want to go through. The transition that takes place as we die physically, nobody's looking forward to it. Was it harmful to Mary and Martha? Absolutely. Was it harmful to his friends? Absolutely. You'll see once Christ gets to Bethany, basically they're a wreck because of what they've gone through. Folks, this whole event caused pain to come upon these people, suffering upon Lazarus and upon these people, and yet the Lord delayed 2 days, knowing these things would take place. Please, you've got to understand this. He knew this stuff would take place, but he still allowed it to take place when he could have stopped it from taking place. Folks, the minute the messenger came to him and said Lazarus is sick, Jesus could have spoken and healed Lazarus if he wanted. But he allowed this to take place for a reason. Okay, let's go on. Then Martha said unto Jesus, Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died. But I know that even now, whatsoever thou wert ask of God, God will give it thee. Boy, that's the great faith of Martha. But I know that even now, whatsoever thou wilt ask of God, God will give it thee. Martha not only had faith in God that he would be able to resurrect Lazarus, but she had such faith in Jesus, knowing he was in such a standing before God, if I can put it that way, that God would do whatever Jesus asked him. Well, why would that be? Because Jesus is God. She knew there was no sin separating Christ from God. Why? Because Christ was sinless. She knew that Christ was the promised Messiah, the very Son of God. Jesus said unto her, Thy brother shall rise again. Martha said unto him, I know that he shall rise again in the resurrection at the last day. So Martha is wondering, are you just meaning that he's going to resurrect in the last day? Jesus said unto her, I am the resurrection and life. He that believeth in me, though he was dead, yet shall he live. Whoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. Believest thou this? She said unto him, Yea, Lord, I believe thou art the Christ, the Son of God, which is come into the world. Right there she says, I believe you're the Messiah. I believe you're the very Son of God. That's why I believe you have such a close relationship to God. Whatever you ask of him, he will do. Now, folks, notice here, Jesus clearly explains what this resurrection of Lazarus is going to prove to everybody who is watching. It would prove to them something about Christ. I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. Do you know what? When Christ resurrected Lazarus, that was proof to everybody watching. That is the resurrection and the life. That Jesus is the one. He's the one we should look to for spiritual life, because he gave physical life back to Lazarus. What an important and tremendous message being on display as he resurrects Lazarus for everybody to see. This is the true one who is the resurrection and the life, Jesus Christ. Do you see why this was such an important miracle to take place, even though there was horrendous suffering involved by Lazarus, Mary, Martha, and his friends? I know. So in our minds, what do we say? Well, gee, the Lord must have been awful, awful mean. He must have been hard-hearted and a mean person, because look, he allowed them to go through all that pain. He allowed them to go through all that suffering when he could have stopped it. What a horrible person he must be. Well, let's see how hard-hearted the Lord is. It goes on. The Jews then which were with her in the house, and comforted her, when they saw Mary, and she rose up hastily and went out, followed her, saying, She goeth to the grave to weep there. Then when Mary was come, and Jesus was, and saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying unto him, Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died. When Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews also weeping which came with her, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. Doesn't sound like a hard-hearted person to me. When he saw the great suffering they were going through, he groans in his spirit. To groan there means a moan of great loss. like you're groaning because you just lost your best friend. You know, during my course of pastoring, I have done several funerals. And there were cases in some of those funerals where somebody was so greatly loved by someone, normally it's a spouse, that the spouse is basically speechless. They fall apart to the point they don't even have anything to say. All they can do is groan. All they can do is just weep. Folks, that's what the Lord is displaying here. He hurts so badly for these people and the great pain they've gone through. So when we think because Jesus delayed for 2 days and allowed Lazarus to die, he must be hard-hearted and not caring about these people, boy, look again. It goes on. He groaned in the spirit and was troubled, and said, Where have ye laid him? And they said unto him, Lord, come and see. What's the very next 2 words? The shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept. Doesn't sound like a hard-hearted person to me. Sounds like a very kind, loving, compassionate, gracious Lord. Weeping at the sight of the burial place of his dear friend. Not only was he suffering inside for the people and how they were suffering, but he was suffering inside at the loss of his friend. Then said the Jews, Behold how he loved him. Folks, for us to get the idea when the Lord brings harmful things into this world as the result of sin, for us to think that's from a hard-hearted Lord that doesn't love us and doesn't care for us and doesn't concern for us, we are totally wrong. You know why? He's doing it for our good. That's why he's doing it. He doesn't get pleasure and joy out of seeing people suffer, but he realizes it must be done to reveal himself. And by revealing himself, he is giving people an opportunity to be saved and to miss an eternity in the lake of fire. How much more gracious and loving can you have? See how when we really understand the role of evil in this world, it changes the way we look at everything that takes place. We no longer question, how can a loving God do these things? Now our question is, how can the Lord be so loving as to do these things? Folks, do you understand that during the most difficult times of our life is when he shows to us himself most clearly? For those who aren't saved, it's one opportunity they have to come to an understanding of who God is and to seek to be in submission to him. For those who are saved, it's a matter of recognizing more about the Lord and entering into a closer walk with him. That's why he allows these things to take place. I hate to even use this example simply because this example pales to what the Lord does for us. I mean, pales greatly, but I guess in a small way this would apply. Any one of you who has children, if you discipline them biblically, there are times they may need a spanking. If you love your child like you do, you're not going to enjoy spanking them. Not a bit. It is truly going to be harder on you than it is on them. Even though they might not understand that at the time, you know. It's true. It's harder for you to spank them than it is for them to go through the spanking. And yet you're doing it out of love because you know the pain that they're feeling during the spanking will work for their ultimate good. Something you won't do is this. If you really love them, you won't put the spanking off and say, well, even though I know they need a spanking, and even though I know it's for their ultimate good, because I don't want to see them shed any tears, I'm just not going to spank them and let it go. That's not a parent that loves a child, because you're not working for their ultimate good. Now, like I said, that example, it pales. I hate to even use that in comparison to this, but in a sense it's so. God is our Heavenly Father. There are times he allows pain in our life for our ultimate good. And it's his love that motivates him. It's his grace and his mercy motivating him. It's not a hardness of heart and a hatred. You can see he was pained as he saw what Mary and Martha went through. You can see he was pained when he saw what Lazarus went through. And yet he still did delay 2 days. He on purpose allowed it to take place for the good of Mary, for the good of Martha, for the good of Lazarus, and for the good of everybody that was going to watch this great event. He did it out of love and out of grace and out of mercy to show himself as the resurrection and the life, giving everyone who saw this thing the opportunity of salvation and the opportunity to grow in grace and in knowledge of him. Jesus wept. Then said the Jews, Behold how he loved him. And some of them said, Could not this man which opened the eyes of the blind have caused that even this man should not have died? Jesus therefore again, groaning in himself, cometh to the grave. Here again now, he is groaning in himself. He's making sounds of mourning, in other words. It was a cave, and a stone lay upon it. Jesus said, Take away the stone. Martha, the sister of him that was dead, saith unto him, Lord, by this time he stinketh, for he hath been dead for 4 days. Now please understand this. She's saying by now his body's already started to decay. We can actually smell it because it's been 4 days. Can you imagine the miracle that took place when they rolled that stone away? You have to imagine the smell would come out. They roll the stone away. They get hit by this smell. Not only them, but the people watching. So everybody knows what's going on inside that cave. They know Lazarus' body is actually already entered into a state of decay. In most people's minds, they would think it's too late. If he'd only gotten here maybe even a day after he had died, maybe he could do something. But man, his body is already decaying. You can actually smell it. The Lord can't raise him up. The Lord does raise him up. To do what? Display his great power. To display that he truly is the resurrection and life. Even when a person's body stinks, he can raise them up. You want a spiritual application to that? No matter how great a person's sin is. In other words, no matter how bad we might stink because of our sin, the Lord can save us and give us spiritual life. That was a part of the lesson he was displaying to everybody that was watching this. He hath been dead 4 days. Jesus saith unto her, Said I not unto thee that if thou wouldest believe, thou shouldest see the glory of God? Then they took away the stone from the place where the dead was laid. Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, thank thee, for thou hast known me, that thou hast heard me. I knew that thou hadst heard me always, but because of the people which stand by I said it, that they may believe that thou hast sent me. And when he had thus spoken, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. And he that was dead came forth, bound both hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was bound about with a napkin. Can you imagine what the people thought? This same man that they had seen with their own eyes was dead. This same man that they had smelled with their nose was decaying, is now walking out of the tomb. And it's all because Jesus simply spoke, Lazarus, come forth. Can you imagine what they learned about Jesus on that day? Folks, that is a lesson that they would never forget. As far as I'm concerned, and the Bible doesn't say this, but if you put yourself in the place of every person that saw that, in my mind, nobody would have ever forgotten that. Anybody present that day, they would never forget what they had just seen with their eyes. Lazarus, come forth, and here he comes. Folks, why did the Lord allow all of this suffering to fall upon Lazarus, Mary, Martha, and all of their friends? This very moment, when Lazarus would step out of that tomb. That's why he allowed it to happen. Because now, at the very moment they saw Lazarus come out of the tomb, their eyes were open and they understood things about Christ they had never understood before. Whether lost or saved in the group, they have now experienced something that they had never experienced. And it was for every one of their ultimate good. I'll bet you. I'm not a betting man. But again, the way that I see things, after Lazarus came forth out of the tomb, if you would ask him, Lazarus, do you regret now becoming sick and dying? Do you feel like the Lord mistreated you in any way by allowing that to happen? Do you know what I bet Lazarus would say? Lord, I thank you for allowing that sickness on me, and I thank you for allowing me to die, because you've now used me to glorify and honor yourself in my life. You've used me as a tool to glorify yourself in a way that very few, if anybody else, ever had the privilege to be used. Thank you for my sickness, and thank you for my death. Folks, sometimes when the things happen in this world that devastate us, the problem is we don't know what God knows. That's the problem. We make judgments based on what we look at, and certainly when we look at things taking place, we say how horrible it is these things are taking place, and they are horrible from our standpoint. But if we understood what the Lord was doing in the background, why this was taking place, many of us, even during the devastation, would praise and honor him. For some, it takes longer to come to an understanding of why he did it. But many times in life, when we look back on the devastation, even here on this earth, we come to the conclusion, Lord, thank you. If nothing else, for some of us, we may have to wait until heaven to see why it happened. But the Lord, I believe, truly will show each one of his children any pain that they went through on earth had a purpose. And he'll show each one of us when we get to heaven why we had to go through what we had to go through. Why he either allowed or actually brought at times different harmful things upon us. And in every case, we're going to say, once we understand why, we're going to say, Lord, thank you. I wouldn't have had it any other way. Jesus said unto him, loose him and let him go. Now please listen to this last verse. Then many of the Jews which came to Mary and had seen the things which Jesus did, believed on him. Folks, that last verse is explanation enough for why these things happened. Many that saw his greatness believed on him, all because he called upon some of his faithful people, Lazarus, Mary, and Martha, to have to suffer a short time, so that many would come to a saving knowledge of him. Think about what missionaries go through. There have been many missionaries who have literally given their lives for the sake of showing other people Christ. Was God unjust to them? I don't think so. Was God mean-hearted to them? I don't think so. How many times have we suffered in our own lives, and the Lord has used our testimony during those times of suffering to show other people their need of salvation? And what's really weird is this: we might not ever even know about it until we get to heaven. Folks, there's one thing a Christian can be sure of. All things work together for good to them that love God. I don't care what we go through in this life as Christians. I don't care how devastating it is. It's all for a purpose, and it is for our ultimate good as God's people. That promise only applies to those who are saved, but I'm talking right now to those who are saved. I don't care what devastating event takes place in our life. I don't care how much pain we have to go through. I don't care how much harm we have to face. It is for our ultimate good, and we can rest assured the Lord either actually caused it or he allowed it for a great purpose, and that is to show himself to the world around us. Lord willing, next week, or in our next video, which will be It'll be video number 8, but in your lesson book it'll be lesson number 7. We're going to kind of summarize everything we've looked at during the course of this series, and we're going to look at some difficult passages in Romans that speak about the Lord and why he allows sin and evil in this world. May the Lord bless you as you study his word.